Welcome to Interesting People in Extraordinary Times. I'm your host, Rick Schroeder, and we're going to get right to it today. This is the first of a two-part series on Ukraine. We're going to head to Kyiv and speak with veteran journalist Phil Ittner, who's covered that region for 30 years in both Russia and Ukraine, knows both areas very well. We're going to talk about the failings of the Biden administration in this war, now about to enter its fourth year, and what might be ahead for Ukraine under the Trump administration. Trump already signaling that he wants new elections in Ukraine. He's already excluded Ukraine from any peace talks so far. And he wants $500 billion in reparations of rare earth minerals from Ukraine, even though Ukraine has probably received less than $100 billion from the U.S. in military aid. So without any further ado, as they say, let's head to Kyiv and speak with Phil Ittner on the situation in Ukraine. Good morning to you. It's 9 a.m. where you are right now as we speak.
Yeah,
Um,
a rather loud morning.
a rather loud morning. Describe that for me.
We were hit by at least one ballistic missile. Uh, we don't. It's that happened about 2 hours ago, maybe a little longer, as we're recording here at 9 a.m. Kiev time. I think they came in sometime between 6 and 7. And of course, we got the anti-aircraft going. Uh, um, I don't know yet. It's too early to say, but it could have been a hypersonic ballistic missile. The Russians have been experimenting with those, uh, which drastically reduces the response time for anti-aircraft and air defenses. Regardless, anyhow, again, still very early for information, but we know three people are dead. It hit some form of water line or something like that and flooded an entire street. Um, and again, it's Moscow hitting Kiev in the wee hours of the morning, which is when they like to do it, either overnight or in the very early hours of the morning, just as dawn is cracking. And it's meant to intimidate, and it's meant to terrorize. It is a terror campaign. There's no reason. There's no military asset that they were firing at. They were just arbitrarily chucking a missile into a city, which they also did the day before at a smaller city called Kyiv. No real military reason for doing it, just to kill Ukrainians and to sow exhaustion and terror and anxiety in the population. One of their other targets that they love to go for, of course, is our electrical and heating grid. Um, they haven't been very successful with that this year. Uh, 23 was far worse. I've been here since the beginning of the full scale invasion. The winter of 23 was far worse than what we have been going through 24 into 25. But they do like to target, trying to deprive us of heating. A lot of heating in Ukraine is centralized heating. So that's a difficult thing to manage. Of course, we have space heaters on our electrical grid. We have, I don't know if I have one ready to hand, but power banks are everywhere. Everybody has um, little you know a little power bank that they can run a light on or what have you. um, and then, I mean, that's just civilian life in Ukraine and in Kiev.
Has fatigue started to set in with some of the people? Are they,
Oh yeah,
is
oh
this
yeah. No, I'm
becoming
exhausted.
too much of a
I'm
grind?
exhausted. No, Well, you're asking two questions there, Rick.
Yes.
And rightfully so. Has exhaustion set in? It set in a long time ago. A long time ago. People hate this war here. And everybody has been affected by it. No, there's not a single person in this country who hasn't lost somebody or who knows somebody who's lost somebody either at the front or in the relentless bombing campaign and the missile attacks, or their lives have been uprooted because they've been ripped from their homes and had to flee. A lot internally, a lot in the near abroad, and that's a topic worth discussing. Um, but yeah, the people here are bone tired of this, and the exhaustion and the drain on your emotions, and living in constant fear. It weighs you down, and you can see it in the population. I talk to my friends and colleagues, and just folks on the street. Go into a cafe or what have you. You see people on the phone and they're crying. You don't have to ask why. You know why. You know. You walk down the street and there are guys walking past you missing limbs. You don't have to ask why. You know why. So the people of Ukraine are utterly, utterly tired and worn down from this war. But then, in response to the second part of your question, nobody's talking about surrender. Nobody's talking about giving up. This is existential. The Russians want to destroy the idea of being Ukrainian, every cultural aspect of being Ukrainian and being independent and sovereign. Um, you know, they don't have a choice. It's the Russians who are doing this. The Ukrainians would stop tomorrow, if they could find a just peace that would be lasting, and that would rid them of this situation. Absolutely. I mean, we started this war with we're going to take everything back to 91, including these eastern provinces, oblasts, they call them, of Donetsk and Luhansk, and the Crimean Peninsula. We're going to get it all back. Well, now, 3 years on, a lot of people are saying, we can probably give up a good chunk of that if this just stops. But it needs to stop in such a way that the Russians aren't incentivized to come back again. And that's an important point to take. And every Ukrainian knows it. The vast majority of Ukrainians.
And I would imagine their history with Russia. So you give up a piece and they stop, but they're coming back. They're going to
Yep,
come
they'll
back.
keep coming. If they get anything, if they get any benefit, they will come back. They have to be. And look, I'm not saying that arbitrarily. You're right. The Ukrainians know their enemy far better than we do. We should listen to them. If there are to be negotiations, we should listen to the Ukrainians because they know the Russians better than anybody. But I lived in Russia. I've been covering and traveling within the former Soviet Union for 30 years, and they're right. They're 100% right. Russia's mentality is intrinsically imperial. They believe in the idea of empire and conquest and grabbing territory. They claim it's for their own protection, but what it really is their sense of greatness on the global stage and controlling assets and all the rest of it. It's straight up an imperial war. I mean, Ukraine is a colony of and has been for 500 some odd years. Um, so yes, Ukrainians know this. They know it, but and they know that if um, Russia is put into a position where it can go back and lick its wounds and come back, they will do so. So, as tired as everybody is, there's a clear acceptance and recognition that they have to fight against Moscow, really, or it'll just keep happening
So
because that's their history.
you know both sides in this conflict. You've been to both sides. So I saw the other day the latest numbers of 815,000 casualties for Russia in this war. 815,000. Um, Mind-boggling.
Hmm.
Th- Is this just they just keep throwing meat at it until they break through? Is that their whole logic here?
Well, you're approaching this as a Westerner,
No. Okay.
with
Yeah.
all due respect. Um, Human life doesn't matter in Russia. Individual human life does not matter. The empire, the state, the nation is what matters. It's drilled into them in a very, very young age. And I know that that sounds like I'm being like a Russophobe or something. They will admit it themselves. They know exactly. I mean, they do. They find us very decadent, and our individualism is very selfish. It is not. It is not the individual. It's not the citizen that matters. It is the greatness of Russia. It is the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, and that always must be expanded. So and you know, part of the reason why the population goes along with it is that they live pretty miserable lives, the vast majority of Russians, where they're stuck in some province that doesn't get any funding from, you know, we think we have an issue with federalization and, you know, federalism in the United States. I mean, you live in the Russian Federation and you would shudder at the idea of that, because of course everything goes to the capital. The state is what matters. All roads lead to Moscow. So when I lived in Russia, and it hasn't changed since I lived there. Admittedly, it was quite a while ago, but I've been going back until this war started, and nothing ever changes in Russia. The provinces don't get anything. It's a one-way road. All relationships are binary, and so they get all the wealth and they suck all the wealth out of the provinces, but they don't return it. So these guys live pretty miserable lives where really, and I know it's a stereotype, but there's a lot of truth to it. The bottle, it's always the bottle. You know, they turn to the vodka bottle, and they're dead by 50 some odd. So they live pretty miserable lives. So when the state, and also the power of the state is absolute internally within Russia. So when they call you for the war, you go to the war. And they don't. So they will grind up their men, because the men don't matter. They have lots of those. What matters is expansionism, imperialism, power, exerting power, to your near abroad, and ultimately the world, really, because Vladimir Putin himself has repeatedly said, he made it a slogan of his last presidential, in quotation marks, election, that Russia has no borders. He said it time and again. It was a slogan: Russia has no borders. The meaning being that Russia will just keep growing, because it is. I mean, it goes into a lot of things about their culture and how they're opposed to Western liberalism and all sorts of things. But the again, this all comes back to this question of the Ukrainian war. And if they take, you know, in peace negotiations, let's say they take the 20% that they claim to hold. They don't really hold it, actually, but let's say they take that 20%, including Crimea. Um, then it'll be more of Ukraine in 5 or 10 years, and then after that, it'll be the Baltics and Poland and Romania. Um, and we should also consider that it isn't just tanks. There's influence. There's getting people getting Europe, continuing Europe, or reinvigorating Europe's addiction to their fossil fuels. They don't have to roll tanks down the Champs Elysees to have power in Brussels, and they're insidious in it. And they've infiltrated our body politic as well, which is maybe something you might want to talk about. It's up to you. But anyhow, that's why the Ukrainians are fighting as hard as they are, because the Russians will just keep going, and their mindset is very different than a Western mindset. If it can be taken, it should be taken, because power and strength are all that matters. And if you can do it, you do it.
Yeah. Trump's boast that he could solve this in one day with a phone call has now gone to at least 100 days or so before we can really affect anything here. What is the attitude of the people there toward this administration coming in and the administration who is left? I'm looking at Kyiv Post today, and they say Biden fumbled the ball a lot in this past 4 years and could have done a lot more. But all in all, he did okay, but could have done a lot more. What do they think they're going to find from the second Trump administration?
Well, let me address Biden first, and then I'll move on to Trump
All
if you
right.
don't mind. Yeah, there's a lot of criticism of the Biden administration because they they were very hesitant about what they feared, the expansion of the conflict or the escalation of the conflict, rather, but also expansion. Um, uh, and that fear led them to be very, I guess, stingy when it came to actually delivering the weapons and providing more weapons, particularly other forms of weaponry, air defense, for example. They wanted a lot more Patriots so they could protect their cities. Um, they wanted lots more long range artillery that could fire into Russia and attack their staging areas. And they were denied that for much of the year until after the election, actually. And they're still having problems with that. Um, People, again, one of the criticisms I see in the States that's wrong and constantly needs to be corrected is we're not sending money to Ukraine. We're sending weapons. We give Lockheed Martin and Raytheon the money that gets allocated, and then they send over, and oftentimes, weaponry that is due to be demolished, or decommissioned, or in the case of ammunition, to be because it spoils after a while. And it's better to get rid of it than to store it. The expense is greater there. So we're really giving Ukraine stuff that we would be destroying anyhow, Bradleys and missiles and things like that, but just enough for them to resist Russia, but not enough for them to win. Is
Mhm.
the criticism, not just here in
Defense,
Ukraine,
but
although
no
folks have the
offense. Yeah.
yeah, and also, as I say, tying one arm behind the back and Ukraine's back, and then sending it off to fight the bear, and they've done extraordinarily well despite it. But yeah, that's the criticism of the Biden administration and why Biden is, uh, you know, is kind of seen in shades of gray here as how helpful he was. I mean, Jake Sullivan comes under a lot of criticism here. Um, Now, what's Trump going to be for Ukraine? The Ukrainians are hoping that there's a path for the Trump administration to actually be rather helpful to Ukraine. They're holding out hope for the Trump administration. I don't have that hope as an American. I This is going to be bad for Ukraine. I really think this is going to be very bad. We're going to go through a very difficult year. Um, his obvious lack of understanding of what's happening here, the lack of understanding of his entire administration so far. I mean, I don't want to go into domestic American politics, but so many of the candidates for Trump's cabinet are, pro-Russian, blatantly, openly, vocally, pro-Russian, anti-Ukraine. Um, and he himself, I know everybody. I tread carefully when I talk about the subject, but I firmly do believe that Donald Trump is compromised. That the Russians have something on him. More than just one thing, I should think, given his character. But they certainly have something. And I won't go into that because we go into a lot of stuff that can't be verified or we don't have documentation of it. Maybe our intelligence agencies do, but the man himself, I think, is compromised. But his entire cabinet has got the Russian mind virus in their head, and they blame Ukraine for this fight, and they, and also, why spend our money there? Well, again, I've already reiterated, we're not giving money to Ukrainians, we're giving money to American arms industry, uh, you know, guys, the suits, and they're sending over the old kit. Um, I think the Trump administration will have to make some sort of go at a negotiated peace, which will mean the involvement of both the Kremlin and Kiev. Uh, I think they underestimate and they don't understand both sides of that equation. Um, Putin can't stop. His entire economy is propped up by the war economy. So it's estimated some 25% of his entire industry has transitioned to making shells and bombs and armored vehicles and tanks and what have you. They have a darn near million man army mobilized in the field. So if tomorrow the war would stop, um, they haven't achieved any of their their primary strategic goals, and they've got all these men in uniform that will be coming home to houses and towns and villages where there's no work because the entire industry has shifted to the war. So he's in a catch 22.
Yeah, there's no
Uh,
brakes on the train, so to speak. I mean, it's
and
just,
he
yeah.
and the meat grinder keeps grinding up, and there's really no benefit to Russia for what they're doing. And I definitely want to touch on that in a bit, but let me just wind up with the incoming Trump administration and any kind of peace negotiations. So Putin's stuck in his catch 22, and Ukraine is fighting for its very life. Um, what I have said repeatedly is even if the entire West and the Europeans are not going to do this, might drive a wedge between Trump and the Europeans as well. But the Europeans are not going to stop providing Ukraine with aid and assistance. The problem is that their industry isn't up to snuff, and it can't match us when it comes to providing kit to Ukraine. But Europe will continue to fight behind Ukraine, stand for Ukraine, unless Russia gets its infiltrates with its intelligence operations. But Europe will keep supporting Ukraine, and Ukraine will keep fighting. Even if Europe were to give up on Ukraine, Ukrainians would not stop fighting. This is the third attempt at a war of independence in the last 100 plus years, in the last century, give or take. This is the third time Ukrainians have fought against Russians to gain their sovereignty and their independence. And they're not going to stop. So that means if Trump's negotiation efforts fail, and what I fear is that he will use that as an excuse to say, oh, this Zelensky guy or these Ukrainians, they're the troublemakers. They won't stop fighting. We go to Putin. Putin agrees with us on something. We take it to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians say is a non-starter, because of course the Kremlin's going to ask for ridiculous stuff. So then Zelensky, or indeed the Ukrainians, they look like the unreasonable ones. The West, or certainly the United States, Trump's America, says, "Well, no, you're the problem. We're not going to fund you anymore, and we're not going to support you." Well, then what happens? What happens is more Ukrainians die. A lot more Ukrainians die, but they don't stop fighting. They'll never stop fighting. It literally is existential. So you're going to have little old ladies with Molotov cocktails in streets getting mowed down. Are we? And then so what? For an ego like Trump to have that on world screens, what's he going to do? That's the man that betrayed Ukraine, and look at what is happening. But Ukrainians will never stop fighting. I mean, I'm not going to leave. I believe in this cause so deeply that I'm not leaving either. This is, we don't quite understand in the United States, I don't think, and I think it's a great fault of the media. What is at stake here? These are two diametrically opposed ideologies. There's an ideological aspect to this. Do you believe in autocracy where the state is the primary interest, or do you believe in a Western democracy where citizens are empowered and are the state? And we're at a crossroads here. And if the Russians win, I lived in Russia. I know how that lifestyle is, that belief system is. This is an existential fight, not just for the Ukrainians, but for all Western democracies. I mean, I have my show that I put out every week called On the Edge. About an hour-long interview show, and at the end of it, I have a slate of Abraham Lincoln, and it's a quote from an 1855, before the Civil War, letter that he writes to a childhood friend who's a slave owner. And in part of it, it's the 1855 Swift letter. Swift, yes, Speed. Sorry, I knew I had that wrong. Glitch in the brain. Newsheimer's, in which he says, if the know nothings gain control of our government, in other words, the guys who've always been with us, whether they're know nothings or America Firsters or the Confederacy or now MAGA. And Lincoln writes in 1855, if that side of our American identity ever gets real power in this country, I would rather immigrate to Russia, where at least they don't pretend to have liberal democracy. He writes that in 1855. That's 1855. They've never changed. They've never ever changed, and they won't until as the great Professor Timothy Snyder, who was, I believe, Yale, writes, unless an empire gets a punch in the nose and loses an imperial war, they won't stop being imperial.
Right.
Russia has to get to a point where it gets a big old punch in the nose and has to go back and look in the mirror.
Thanks for watching and or listening to Interesting People in Extraordinary Times. I'm Rick Schroeder. You can find us on most podcast apps and on youtube.com. And we'll be back soon with part 2 of our series on Ukraine.